There's a moment most people who've been remote for a few years describe in roughly the same way. They're in the kitchen making coffee at 11 a.m., and they realize, not dramatically, just quietly, that they haven't spoken out loud yet today. Not to a colleague. Not to anyone. They've sent 43 messages. They've been on 2 calls. They have a full inbox and a full calendar, and they haven't spoken out loud. That specific silence is what this video is about. Not loneliness as a feeling, the mechanism that produced it. The one that was running quietly in the background for most of your working life, building your social world without you ever having to think about it. And that stopped one day without announcement, because something specific happened to a generation's social infrastructure over the last 5 years, and almost no one has explained exactly what it was. Here is something most people don't know about how adult friendship actually forms. It is not primarily driven by intention. It is not driven by effort, not by charisma, not by going to the right events or saying the right things or being particularly good at conversation. The research on this is actually quite old and quite clear. Most adult friendships form through something called the propinquity effect, the tendency for physical proximity, repeated over time, to generate connection automatically. What that means in plain terms: if you are near the same person regularly, you will almost certainly develop some degree of warmth toward them. Not because you chose to, not because you made an effort, because proximity by itself does the work. The studies behind this go back to the 1950s, when researchers at MIT examined how friendships formed among residents of a housing complex. The finding was simple and striking. The single strongest predictor of whether 2 people became friends was not personality, not shared interests, not even how much they liked each other on first meeting. It was physical distance. The closer 2 people lived, the more likely they were to become friends. The effect was nearly automatic. The office was running this engine for you. Every workday, you were placed in physical proximity with the same people, repeatedly, over time. You passed them in the hallway. You sat near them at lunch. You were in the same room, on the same floor, inhabiting the same physical space. Not because you chose them, but because the architecture of work put you there. And that proximity was quietly, invisibly, building your social world. The colleague who became a real friend. The person you'd grab coffee with without planning it. The relationship that never had a moment of intention behind it. It just emerged from the fact that you kept being near each other. That wasn't luck. That was propinquity. That was an engine running in the background of your working life, producing social connection as a byproduct of physical presence. And most people never knew it existed. Which means most people never knew when it stopped. So let's talk about what happened when that engine shut down. March 2020, the engine stops. Not dramatically. Not with a warning. One day the building is there, and the next day the building is not. And with it, every hallway, every lunch table, every corridor where you used to pass the same person 3 times a week without thinking about it. In the first months, most people didn't feel it as social loss. They felt it as disruption. The strangeness of working from home, the novelty of video calls, the strange intimacy of seeing colleagues, living rooms. There was enough novelty to mask what was actually happening underneath. What was happening underneath? The engine had stopped producing. By 2021, something subtler had set in. The acute strangeness had worn off. What replaced it was a quieter condition. The normalization of days that were full of communication and empty of contact. Slack messages, emails, video calls where everyone's face was a small rectangle, carefully framed. An enormous volume of words exchanged, and almost none of them accidental. Because that's the other thing that disappeared when the building disappeared. The accidental conversation, the one that wasn't scheduled, the one that didn't have an agenda, the one that happened because you were both reaching for the coffee machine at the same time, and then somehow 20 minutes passed, and you learned something about each other that no video call agenda would ever have surfaced. Research on remote work that emerged through this period consistently found that fully remote workers reported higher levels of loneliness than their in-office counterparts. Not because remote workers are more isolated by temperament, but because the structural conditions that generated incidental contact had been removed. The Gallup data on this is specific. Globally, around 1 in 5 employees reported feeling lonely at work, with the rate significantly higher among those working fully remote. But the loneliness wasn't the whole story. The loneliness was a symptom. The underlying condition was something else. The gradual atrophying of the social infrastructure that had been maintaining their adult friendships, not just at work, but beyond it. Because here is what the 5-year timeline actually produced. By 2022, 2023, 2024, the friendships that had been sustained by proximity began to drift. The colleagues who had been real friends, who you'd have grabbed a drink with on a Thursday, became people you occasionally messaged. The connections that had felt solid revealed that what had been holding them together was the building. Take the building away long enough, and the connective tissue thins. Not because anyone stopped caring. Because the engine that was doing the maintenance work had stopped running. And the people living this didn't have a name for it. They just felt, over time, like something was quietly leaking out of their social world. And they didn't know what, and they didn't know why, and in the absence of a structural explanation, the explanation that filled the gap was a personal one. Maybe I've become someone who is hard to stay close to. Maybe the problem is me, which brings us to the advice you've probably already tried. This is where the standard advice enters. And this is where it fails. Not because it's wrong in theory, but because it's designed for a world where the Propinquity engine is still running. Put yourself out there. Go to the events. Download the app. Here is what that advice is actually asking of you. It is asking you to manually replicate through conscious effort and social courage something that used to happen automatically and invisibly. It is asking you to generate through intention what proximity used to generate through repetition. To produce through performance what the office produced as a byproduct of showing up. That is not a small ask. That is an enormous ask. That is the social equivalent of being told that your car's engine has been removed and the advice is, try walking faster. And there's a specific reason it tends not to produce the same results. Proximity works because it is low stakes and repeated. You passed your colleague in the hallway 30 times before you ever had a real conversation. The relationship developed in the background, below the threshold of social risk, before either of you had decided to invest in it. A networking event, a meetup, a first conversation with a stranger. These are high-stakes, single-instance interactions. The pressure to connect is explicit. The effort is visible. Everything that proximity used to absorb, the awkwardness, the small talk, the time before you know whether you actually like each other, is now compressed into 90 minutes in a room where everyone is trying. The social researcher Jeffrey Hull's work suggests that close friendship typically requires around 200 hours of shared time to develop. The office was quietly accumulating those hours for you, in small increments, across months and years, without anyone having to count. The networking event offers too. So if you've tried the advice, the events, the apps, the making yourself go, and found it produce connections that felt thin or evaporated quickly, that is not evidence of a personal failure. That is evidence that you were using a tool designed for a different problem. The Propinquity engine built your friendships. The advice assumes the engine is still running. It isn't. And no amount of effort, or courage, or willingness to be vulnerable at a Tuesday evening mixer is going to replicate what proximity produced automatically over years. That is what actually happened to adult friendship over 5 years of remote work. Not a character flaw, not a failure of effort. A specific social mechanism, documented, named, measurable, that was removed from your life without announcement and replaced with advice that was never designed for its absence. Not your fault, and also not your sentence. There is a longer version of everything this video just named. The full structural case, every mechanism, the research that makes this irrefutable, and it exists for the moments when the self-blame comes back. Because it will come back. Knowing this once is not always enough. The resource in the description is built specifically for that. A complete, evidence-grounded account of the structural forces that dismantled your social world. Written for the version of you that needs to hear it again at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. The link is below and in the pinned comment. Now let's talk about what you can actually do with this understanding. Understanding the mechanism changes what the path forward looks like. If the problem isn't character, if it's the absence of a specific structural condition, then the question isn't how to become a better, braver, more socially skilled version of yourself. The question is, how do you rebuild the condition, not the office, the condition the office created? Repetition, low stakes, no agenda, physical proximity over time. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Because it reframes the entire project. The advice that has been failing you asks for courage. What the propinquity effect actually requires is repetition. Those are very different things. Courage is a trait. Repetition is a practice. One you either have or you don't. The other, you can engineer. What this looks like in practice is not dramatic. It is not joining a club or attending a seminar on making friends. It is finding one place, one specific, physical, recurring place, where you are likely to encounter the same small number of people over time, without any pressure for those encounters to go anywhere. A coffee shop you go to at the same time most mornings, a gym class with a fixed schedule, a co-working space 2 days a week. Not because those places will produce instant friendship, because over time, proximity will start doing what proximity does, quietly, automatically, below the threshold of social risk, in the same way it did inside the building you left. The 200 hours won't accumulate in a day, they won't accumulate in a month, but they will accumulate. And the place where most people get stuck is not the accumulation itself. It's the belief that effort should produce faster results than proximity actually allows. That if they've been going somewhere for 6 weeks and they don't have a real friend yet, something must be wrong. Nothing is wrong. The engine is just slow. It was always slow, you just didn't notice before because it was running in the background. There's one other thing worth naming before this ends. These videos are a map. A map is useful. A map tells you where you are, what the terrain looks like, why you got here, what the path forward might be. But at some point, you have to leave the map. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just the next small movement. The one recurring place, the one Wednesday morning, the one not particularly impressive interaction that starts accumulating hours you can't see yet. That is the whole thing. Not confidence, not courage, not a better version of yourself. Just proximity. Repeated, with a little patience for how long it actually takes. If what this video named is something you want to go deeper on, the full structural case, the complete evidence, the resource in the description is built exactly for that. It's also there for the next time the self-blame surfaces. Because knowing this once is rarely enough. Link in the description and in the pinned comment. Think back to the last friendship you made without trying, the one that just happened because you kept being in the same place. Where were you? The version of this that most content tells you is simple. Remote work is lonely. Here are 5 ways to cope. That version does not take your situation seriously. What actually happened over the last 5 years is more specific and more structural than that framing allows. A mechanism that had been building your social world for you, invisibly, automatically, without requiring anything of you beyond physical presence, was removed from your daily life. Nobody named it when it left. Nobody explained that the friendships you were accumulating were being accumulated for you by a force you couldn't see. Nobody told you that the drift you'd feel in the years after wasn't a verdict. It was the predictable outcome of losing something most people never knew they had. And then, into that gap, came advice designed for a different world. Advice that asked you to do consciously and effortfully and at social risk what proximity used to do automatically and below the threshold of awareness. You tried some of it. Maybe most of it. And when it didn't produce what the office used to produce, the explanation that filled the silence was a personal one. That explanation was wrong. Not wrong in the comforting, everything is fine sense. Wrong in the specific, verifiable, here is what actually happened sense. The path out of this is not about becoming someone different. It's about rebuilding the condition. Not the office, but the thing the office was doing. Repetition. Low stakes. Physical presence over time. The slow, unsexy, entirely real accumulation of hours that proximity turns into friendship is harder to engineer deliberately than it was to receive automatically. That's honest. It requires more patience than the standard advice implies. That's also honest. But the mechanism works. It has always worked. It worked for you before, invisibly, inside buildings you didn't think twice about entering. The fact that you have to be more intentional about it now is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's the predictable consequence of a structural change that your social world was never warned was coming. You understand that now, not as reassurance, as map. And the map, at least, is accurate.